Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 of our course Appreciating and Writing Popular Non-Fiction Books. Today we're going to talk about form and structure, organizing research material, finding patterns and deciding on form and structure. In lectures 5 and 6, if you recall, we talked about doing research, this extremely essential function in non-fiction. We talked about our primary and secondary sources. We talked about various research methods and approaches. We talked about using the library and the archive. We talked about the qualities that a good researcher required: patience, perseverance, resourcefulness. We went over some of the tips on how best to prepare for doing research. For instance, what to carry with you to the archive, how to prepare before you do an interview, how to get the best out of each particular method that you adopt. We considered also some of the pitfalls of research, not knowing when to stop, for instance. And we talked about the ethical considerations that have to go into thinking about research methodology. And we talked about the thrill of discovery, of course, how the findings and data that one uncovers, which makes months or years of digging and investigation seem totally worthwhile. But now that let us assume that we have spent all this time, months, years collecting our data. We have finished our research. We are satisfied that we have enough material. You know, we've kind of filled our notebooks and our computers, and here we are sitting with all this pile of data. Where do we go next? One would think that at this point one should be getting on with the writing, right? Because our aim is, of course, to produce a book. And here we've spent so much time researching and collecting material. Now we feel that, you know, there is a sort of urgency of getting on with the writing, which of course is another kind of undertaking with its own problems and difficulties. But yes, that beast of writing has to be wrestled with. Hundreds and thousands of words have to be produced, you know, some not very good words which one will throw away, and so draft after redraft, all that will have to be done. But we do not jump from research to writing. That's not how it works at all. There is a very, very critical intermediate step before you kind of move from research to writing. And that step involves making sense of all this data, this whole big pile and mountain that you have collected, and we will come to that shortly. But there is associated with it another important step of arriving at a suitable form and structure. Okay, as I said, so one part of the process is here you have all this data. What is it telling you? What does it contain, and how do we make sense of it? How do we arrange it? That's one issue. And the second is, what form and structure will we put this in? Now, typically your research, your subject should guide you on the form and structure. But since we are kind of, you know, this is a kind of introduction to many of these aspects, I'm going to kind of first talk about form and structure, so then we can kind of put the two together. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about form and structure before we talk about how to actually organize your material. So what is form and structure? Form and structure basically means that you have an idea. You start out with an idea of wanting to write something. It could be your life story, it could be writing about a phenomena. You want to write about climate change, for instance, or you want to write about animals, for instance. You want to write about let's say cattle production, or um, um, someone has recently written a really wonderful book about dogs. Um, it could be anything. It could be about migration, for instance. You want to cover that phenomena, for instance, about uh, current kind of the current scenario in migration, for instance. It could be any subject, but you do have to, it has to have a certain form which contains it. And that will become clearer as we talk. These are questions of style as well as organization. Both kind of go hand in hand. So it's a little difficult to separate the two, which is why I'm talking about form and structure before I'm actually talking about organizing your material. One has to be aware of, if you read a lot of books as an aspiring writer, one would read a lot of books and have some idea of what kinds of forms and structure. Form and structure, again, these two words sometimes are interchangeable, and they also have a separate sort of meaning. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But if you have read a lot of books, then you will be aware that there are many ways in which you can convey your information. There are many ways, there are many lengths. I mean, your book could be a small book, it could be an extremely large book. We've talked about subgenres, for instance, already, about the memoir form, autobiography, a journalistic study. We've talked about all these, but this is now even a more kind of sort of detailed, let's say, subsection. So, in a way, we've already dealt with the genres, and let's assume that you have, you've already written a book with a certain larger genre in mind. But what kind of form will you give it, and how will you structure it? So let's talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so as I said, you have your material, and you are keen to start writing, but before you do that, you have to figure out the form. Now, broadly speaking, you can choose between an expository form and a narrative form. These are just categories, and we're just using them for the purpose of explaining and understanding something. Expository means something is intended to explain or describe something. An expository essay, these are just some broad definitions of what expository means, provides a clear, focused explanation of a particular topic, process, or set of ideas. It doesn't set out to prove a point, just to give a balanced view of its subject matter. This is important to keep in mind, that it's not trying to give you a kind of, trying to persuade you. It's just giving you a balanced view of its subject matter. Expository writing explores, shares, explains, or defines a specific subject or idea. Some synonyms for expository include informative, descriptive, interpretive, explanatory, elucidative, exegetic, explicative. Okay, but let me illustrate what I mean by expository with an example. I'm just going to read out a few lines which I picked out from a National Geographic site. It's talking about geography and trying to define geography. Geography is the study of places and the relationships between people and their environments. Geographers explore both the physical properties of Earth's surface and the human society spread across it. They also examine how human culture interacts with the natural environment and the way that locations and places can have an impact on people. Geography seeks to understand where things are found, why they are there, and how they develop and change over time. Now you can see how, the writing is extremely straightforward. It's just got a single point aim of providing information. This is the kind of passage that you would have come across many times in your textbooks, right? Something that is just telling you what is, what is a pen, what is geography, what is the sun, or what is the moon. It's just a simple, straightforward explanation. Okay, let's go to the other form, the category, the broad category that we picked out earlier, narrative. Narrative, as you probably know, means story or the art of telling a story. And narrative form is one which enables the writer to tell a story, very, very broadly speaking. Narrative form can use elements like plot, characters, and dramatic action. Now, this should remind you of our earlier lecture on fiction, where we talked about literary genres, and we talked about fiction, and we talked about the script for a play or a film, which uses things like, well, we talked about plot, characters, settings, dramatic action. And now, as I said at that point, even though non-fiction is not fiction, it's not a play script, we can still draw lessons from those other literary genres. So here in the narrative form, even though we're talking about non-fiction, we're talking about the possibility of using elements like plot, characters, and dramatic action. Narratives can be linear or non-linear. We will explain that in a minute. But it also means that you can play around with things like the order of events and the point of view and perspective. Now, the reason I've made this sort of broad division between expository and narrative is to try and now kind of talk a little bit about how books can be structured, what kind of forms can be employed. But also we'll talk a little bit about the more sort of recent trends in writing, because things don't stay static, things evolve, and styles of writing have evolved greatly over time. So let's go back a little bit to our previous lectures where we talked about subgenres in popular nonfiction, like the autobiography, the memoir, the biography, self-help, how-to books, and then of course books divided by sort of subject matter, so by field, by science, or books about science, books about history, books about technology, and the various other subgenres that exist in the field of nonfiction. Now, at one time, it used to be kind of said that certain subgenres of popular nonfiction, such as, for instance, the popular version of textbooks. I don't mean textbooks that we talked earlier about textbooks not being part of our discussions because they are not popular in the sense that they are not mainstream reading. But sometimes, there are certain books that could be kind of very important in certain fields, as used as important texts and reference books, but yet can transcend and transition to the mainstream. So those sort of books, for instance, self-help books and how-to books, had to be expository. That was a certain kind of thinking earlier. I mean, that was, it seemed that was how those books took on those sort of expository forms. And then it seemed as if a whole other range of books, such as history books, for instance, could take on, could be narrative in form. Now, I believe, from my reading, that this is no longer true. And that this is perhaps a sort of somewhat older approach. And in the contemporary scenario, in fact, the kind of expository writing that I read out, earlier, that sort of definition of geography, let me sort of go back to it for a second just to, geography is the study of places and the relationships between people and their environments. Geographers explore both the physical properties of Earth's surface and the human society spread across it. I would suggest that kind of expository writing is very uncommon. You're not likely to find it in popular nonfiction. And here is where we kind of come to try and sort of define that little extra, not a little extra, actually, a lot extra, that makes that jump from something that could be a textbook or something that is a kind of niche, a book with a very niche audience, to something that appeals to a wider audience. And that is what we're trying to kind of trying to define it when we talk about popular nonfiction. That's why that word popular is in the title of our course. And that popular at this particular point has to do with style, and style has to do with form and structure. And so we will talk more about, of course, the writing itself, which is a very important element of style. But right now, in the context of form and structure, we're bringing in writing style a little bit, but we're trying to set the stage, in fact, so that then we can offer a more kind of practical guide for moving forward. Okay, so as I said, in the contemporary scenario, you really cannot just go with straightforward expository writing. There are exceptions to that, and I'm going to come to that. But popular writing, popular nonfiction writing in the contemporary context requires something more, something of a slightly different approach. Now, what is that more? We're going to look at a few examples of recent books and try and capture what more we're talking about. Okay, so one is an extremely creative form of literary nonfiction, which we are not going to discuss over here, because over there the form and structure are completely kind of the options are just extremely diverse, and there is no way right now we can kind of fit that a discussion of form and structure in those kinds of books, in books of literary nonfiction over here. So we're going to talk about it in this form in the next lecture. So let's just assume this would be, as I would say, a sort of more creative and more ambitious form. So we will leave that for the next lecture. Now, the second one could be a mix of expository and narrative form. So here is a book that I found that kind of reflected that quite nicely. This is a book, if you just look at the title, it's Space, Life, Matter, The Coming of Age of Indian Science, a book by Hari Pulakat. Now, if you just look at the title and you see what it's doing, it's talking about Indian science, the evolution of Indian science, and you would imagine that this is a book that would be extremely expository in format, that you would expect it to kind of just explain things, possibly like a textbook. You would think that, but the way this writer has dealt with his material is a little different. The book opens, for instance, with a scene. I talked about scene setting, all these devices that can be used in the narrative form. So it opens with a scene of 3 young students from Bombay visiting the town of Kolar, which is the site of course, the Kolar gold fields. And they're visiting this site in 1951 to meet the chief surveyor to seek permission to set up scientific experiments in the mines. So it opens up with a kind of more narrative sort of story. You have the characters of these 3 people, and you have the surveyor, and you have their conversation, and you have the setting of the Kolar minefields. The book talks more later on. I mean, it goes on to talk more about these young men who are actually go on to become India's leading scientists, and to reveal more about the path-breaking advances made by India's scientists. But the style continues then to mix storytelling and explanation. So this is kind of one example of where where the subject matter at an earlier time might have called for a more expository treatment, when now the author brings in narrative elements and combines the two to kind of evoke a certain atmosphere and engage the reader. And I think engaging the reader is a very important component because you're talking about popular nonfiction. You have to engage the reader. You have to draw the reader into your material. Okay. Another example, another kind of possibility is where the style is expository. It is plainly and simply expository, but it is charged with the personality and authority of the writer, who is a celebrity expert and who is known to be so by his or her public appearances. So let us say it could be someone like a lifestyle coach, someone like Mary Kondo, or a celebrity chef like a Vikas Khanna or a Sanjeev Kapoor. So here is an example of one of Sanjeev Kapoor's books on cooking. So again, as I said, what happens is that when you look at a book like this, you already know the person. You're already familiar with the person who's writing that book. You've seen that person perhaps on TV shows. You've seen that person perhaps live giving talks. You know who that person is, what that person does, and what that person is known for. And you probably will pick up that book because of the person's celebrityhood. And so, as I said, the writing, even if it is, if it's a kind of, if a lifestyle coach is telling you how you should declutter your house, for instance, and will be using phrases that the person is perhaps known for, but it will be more expository because it's telling you what to do, and that is the reason you pick up the book, is exactly that. The next example is a bit similar but slightly different as well. Here I'm talking about a kind of, again, a motivational how-to book by a motivational speaker. It's a recent bestseller called Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. The writer is James Clear, who is known for his motivational writing, has a very popular newsletter. And in this book, what he does is he starts by making a personal connection with the reader. He starts by talking about an accident that he had happened to him in high school, which left him, left him with certain kind of handicap at that point in his life, which encouraged him to inculcate good habits, which is, by doing this, by kind of making a beginning like that, he is establishing in a way a kind of very friendly and human way, a sort of idea that, well, I have been here and this is what I did. And so it helps to ease the path for the reader, I imagine, who says, well, yes, I am also in need of inculcating and developing good habits. And here is this person who was at one point similarly handicapped, in need of developing good habits. So it starts like that, but it then goes on to become much more expository in style. In fact, one reader said it was, one of the readers providing feedback to the book said it was actually so sort of clinical, it was almost technical. But in this case, it is actually the ability of the writer to distill these sort of very complex ideas and, takings from various fields like neuroscience and various other kinds of areas, and trying to kind of distill these sort of learnings and distill them into very simple behaviors that can be easily applied to daily life and work, which is actually a plus point in this case. Recall that I've been saying that I've just been saying that expository writing, plain and simple expository writing, seems to belong more to a textbook, and popular nonfiction seems to require something more that will engage the mainstream reader, the layperson. And This is a sort of, I guess, a semi-exception where we are kind of, where it seems like the audience is perhaps looking for very clear guidelines on what to do, very clear takeaways from someone who they believe has the ability to point them in the right direction. So here, as I said, that kind of expository form can be an advantage. This is the book. Sorry, I should have brought it up earlier. Tiny changes, remarkable results. Very clear, very direct, as I said. Okay. Another example. Here, the writer makes expository writing interesting through the use of vivid examples and accessibility in style. So, good writing. I'm talking about Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, a very popular current book. And I'm going to kind of, since we're going to talk about form and structure, I just want to pull up the contents, some of just the beginnings of his contents page, just to show you how he's arranged the book. So, as I said, it sort of veers towards the expository, but there is still some sort of animated kind of writing that charges it in ways where a straightforward textbook explanation would not be charged in that similar manner. So let's look at, part one is titled The Cognitive Revolution. Part two is the Agricultural Revolution. Part three, the Unification of Humankind. Part four, the Scientific Revolution, all very textbookish. But look at the subheads. An Animal of No Significance, The Tree of Knowledge, A Day in the Life of Adam and Eve, The Flood, History's Biggest Fraud, Building Pyramids, Memory Overload, There is No Justice in History, The Arrow of History, The Scent of Money, Imperial Visions. All these are very evocative phrases. The Law of Religion, and they're loaded phrases. They're kind of also expressing a point of view, which, as we saw in expository writing, we do not have a point of view. It's a kind of more balanced, neutral, straightforward explanation. Okay, here just to wind up, the discovery of ignorance, the marriage of science and empire, the capitalist creed, the wheels of industry, a permanent revolution, and they lived happily ever after. So, just when you look at this, you kind of are already feeling the writer's personality, which you would not in expository writing. In expository writing, the writer is just out. It does not come into, is sort of removed. It's just the words and telling you something, explaining something to you. Another example of this kind of writing that I've come across recently is a slightly older science communicator called Isaac Asimov. And I recently kind of read his essays written some time ago, and it was like a series of expositions explaining concepts, complex scientific processes and so on, but extremely accessible. And also the writer's personality, the writer talks about, he makes it personal at points. And so it's kind of expository, but it's not also. It's very much charged with the writer's personality and the sort of the need to talk to a person who is not in the same field. That sort of care and concern that the writing should engage and should communicate clearly. That, I think, is an important add-on to a kind of process of explaining something. Another example, another way of handling this is to use visuals and graphics to accompany the text. So here I've kind of picked this book called The Great Arc. It's the dramatic tale of how India was mapped and Everest was named by John Key. It's actually a kind of wonderful book, and it's a wonderful sort of, the story itself is kind of quite gripping. But if I just tell you what the story is about, you could think that it could easily be a textbook, right? So the story is about, I mean, the content of the book is, it tells us of the measurement of a meridian or longitudinal arc extending from the tip of the Indian subcontinent to the mountains of the Himalayas. And this is a very significant event, which resulted in all sorts of discoveries being made, and it also made possible all sorts of discoveries, including, for instance, the kind of height of the Himalayas, measuring that, and made possible the construction of roads and railways and so on. Now, in this book, the writer has included a lot of photographs, maps, and so it adds to the kind of uh, um, engaging quality of the book, because it allows you to, because the writing can be a bit, the kind of explanations and what you're dealing with can be sort of technical and somewhat of niche interest, but of course the writer also makes kind of evident the wider significance of this survey, as well as the use of visuals does sort of enhance the power of mainstreamizing this kind of work. So in general, the use of photos, maps, poetry, and storytelling helps us to make a kind of difficult and specialized subject widely accessible. So these are some ways of kind of understanding how people have approached writing that could have been a sort of dry explaining of things, and made it more lively, animated it, brought the reader in by using various little techniques, either the personality of the writer, the celebrityhood of a writer, using bits of storytelling, using visuals. All these are ways that one can deal with subject matter that is somewhat perhaps difficult to comprehend at one go. These are kind of techniques. This is what makes writing. When we say, what does a writer do? A writer, we've talked about research, and that is something that one does in other fields. What does it mean to take that research and then turn it into a book that people will buy, people will read for pleasure, while they also being informed? The writer has to add something. We could call it style, but style itself has components, as we said, form, structure, tone, voice. All these things are important. So let's just look at some of the strategies that we've kind of covered at the moment. An ambitious literary style, which we will talk about in the next lecture, mixing expository and narrative fiction, extreme clarity and connect with the audience, making explanations vivid and fascinating, using visuals and graphics to lighten the text. So let's move on now. Now that we've talked about a form a little bit, and we will, as I said, form, structure, all these things are sort of combined. So even though I will be saying, now we've talked about form, and I'm going to say right now that we are now going to talk about structure, there is quite a bit of overlap very often between these two ideas, so between these two concepts. But form and structure are very closely linked. You decide what form your book will take, and then you have to figure out how to arrange all your data. But both form and structure have to come out of something. You could think, as a novice writer, it's likely that people will think that when they start thinking that, oh, I'm going to write a book, that they know the kind of book they want to write. And possibly they will write that kind of book. Or, if they've read enough, then perhaps instinctively they kind of know the form and structure that they are aiming for. But more likely, the form and structure will come out of your experience of researching and collecting material. So even if let's take something very simple. Let's assume that you want to write a book about cooking, and you just want to have many recipes in the book. Let's say that that is your aim. It seems like a fairly simple aim, but people who write recipe books usually kind of try out the recipe and see, because you have to writing a recipe is also an art. You have to make it simple and clear enough. The instructions have to be very clear and very detailed. Depending on, of course, the complexity of the dish that you are making, but they have to communicate it to a reader who will then presumably try out the recipe. So you have to kind of make it as accessible and simple for that reader. And so when you are writing the recipe, the person will be trying out the recipe, and that is the form of research that a writer of a cookery book will be engaged in. Now, while doing that research, it's possible that the person who's writing that book says, "Oh, I would like to include some tips because I almost burnt that dish doing X thing," or maybe there is another way to do this thing if a person does not have, let's say, an oven, or needs another kind of a technique to do this. I could give some tips. So maybe I would like to enrich my book with some tips. So that could be one. Secondly, perhaps the writer thinks, "Oh, you know what, I think I would like to not just have one photograph of each dish. I would like to have a step-by-step photographs of each step." So these are all ideas that come when you do your research. So, you can begin, as I said, you can start out by saying, "This is what I'm going to do." But the form and structure might need to change. The content will, as you research, as you collect your material, it will tell you something. And as you read it, it will tell you something. It will tell you that you need a different approach. You need to go back and do a little more research. You need to, "I think I want a new form. I think I need to write this book completely differently. What was I thinking? I need to do something quite different." Or it will tell you, it will confirm your original idea, but it will add certain embellishments to it. It's a bit like buying or renting an apartment, and you might have a very clear idea in your head of how you want it to look. You might even have all the things that are going to go into the house, the furniture, etc. And you just think, "Oh, I'm going to add a few things more, and this is how I want my house to look." But then when you actually enter the apartment and you actually see what are the constraints of the apartment and the possibilities of the apartment. Now, you might have 2 windows in one room where you expected to have no windows. You might have a very short sort of, the wall might be much sort of smaller than you had envisaged. You thought your wardrobe would go over there. So you then have to start kind of making adjustments and adaptations and try and see it in a completely new way. So it's a little bit like that, arriving at the kind of suitable form and structure for your book. So let's get back to our book. We started with the idea. We started by talking about where does the idea come from, how a writer gets an idea. We talked about how a writer then goes about kind of collecting material, or even if it's just the coincidences that happen, which allows a writer to enter into a certain experience. And then, of course, collecting more material, doing research. We've talked about research, we've talked about all the problems with research and how long it takes, etc., etc. But now you are at a point where you have most of your material. You have perhaps, say, all your material. And you suddenly have masses of data. I mean, while you were researching, one tends to not think. You're just going on and on, adding to your research. One pointer which I kind of forgot to mention earlier, and I'm putting it, I'm kind of saying it now, is that when you do research, a very useful tip is to, let's say you do an interview, go back home and try and immediately transcribe the interview. Uh, Immediately sort of put it out. If you take photographs in an archive, try and immediately download them. This also frees up your the space in your, the memory in your device, but it also ensures that all your material is with you, that it's not lost, and it saves time now. Because believe me, when you are confronted with all your research material, it's a very daunting position to be in. And it helps if a lot of it is kind of already, at least sort of some kind of order and some kind of neatness has been put into it. So, but let me now kind of envisage this. You have finished your research, you have all this mass of data, stacks of notebooks, dozens of files and folders on your computer. I can imagine books, with post-its telling you, oh, go back and refer to this page. This is where you'll find something here. Loose papers, a lot of, maybe visuals, maps, all sorts of stuff strewn around you. And now you have to bring order to this. Right? I mean, we talked about form and structure, we talked about writing. And as I said, you're not even, it's like unless you climb this mountain and get out to the other side, you cannot even begin to think about writing, let alone, even the form and structure are still a little way away. So how do you proceed? Well, first of all, just take a deep breath and look at everything you have as something that does not have to be conquered in a day. It is going to take much more than that, but don't be intimidated by it. So the first step is that I would suggest, from my personal experience as a writer. I'm sure different writers have different ways of working, but this is what I would suggest, is that you assemble everything in one place. So that's the first step. So if you have interviews or data that you have taken from books or whatever, put it all in once. Put it all on your computer. Put it all in. Put the books away, and if you kind of got stuff that you've taken from there, quotes and so on, that text, put it all in one place. Okay. If there is written material, things that do not go onto your computer, then and I assume you're using a computer. I'm sorry that there might be people here who still like to prefer to write by longhand. So do adapt my suggestions to that. But keep your books, stack your books up neatly. If there are any references or whatever, make everything seem to be similar. Try and decrease the kind of differences between all your material. Because what that will do is bring some order into your mind, because you see everything in the same form. It helps to, because what you're trying to do now is trying to bring clarity. And it is difficult when you have, while researching, gone off in so many varied directions. Okay. Once you have assembled everything, and as I said, download your photographs, make folders, put them all on your computer, get all your text put on your computer as well. Then the next step is to read everything. Read everything. Read everything once, read everything twice, 3 times, as many times as you need to let it sink in, absorb it. You will not make sense of it in the beginning. It will seem too much. It will be frightening, and it will, or there is the other possibility which can be equally frightening, where you feel you don't have enough. and you have to go right back to the research stage and do a little more work, and that's a very valuable realization to make. And if you must do that, then that's what you need to do at that point. But let's continue with the organizational process and assume that, let's say, you have enough, maybe too much, or if there are gaps, then at least you can identify the gaps. Keep looking at your material, keep absorbing it. If you don't understand it the first time, you will understand more of it the next time, and even more the next. So be patient and just go through the process. Keep doing that. It also helps, I find, at least this is something that I practice and it might be helpful for you, is to keep making points. Keep making points of what you're reading. So I mean, don't write out the whole thing, but let's say that if there is a certain place that's described, then write down just the name of the place, make a note of that. If in an interview someone has said something regarding a certain experience or whatever, just note that particular thing down. So make these so what will happen then is that you will have a shorter kind of more manageable ledger, which you can look through instead of reading all the material all over again. That should sort of spark off and trigger off your memory and remind you of the larger things that you have assembled. So now, once we do that, we still have to, I say, organize your material. But when we look at all this, when we look at all our points, when we look at all our material and in its various forms, interviews, quotes, etc., and as I said, try and bring it together, try and use the same point size, try and use the same format and the same font. It becomes a little easier. It kind of reduces the cacophony of the material and, gives it some kind of semblance of order and familiarity and similarity. When you read it, what you will find happening is that certain patterns will become evident, certain argument will become evident, certain subsections of arguments will become evident, and it still will be daunting because you still don't know how to arrange them for a reader, in fact. So while you might be very excited by this argument that, or a hypothesis that suddenly springs from all the material, but how do you allow a reader to take that journey that you have already taken? You've taken it through your research, you've taken it through reading all the research. Now, how do you communicate it in a way that is extremely attractive, engaging for a reader, and also explains to the reader what you have understood? Okay, so the first thing, of course, is to figure out what are you saying. What is the principal argument and what are the subsidiary arguments? What is tying everything together? Yeah, what are its parts? When you look at your data in light of what you already know, then, as I said, patterns will emerge, arguments will emerge. This is probably one of the hardest parts of writing, one of the most challenging ones. You allow your material to tell you what it is, and for you to keep it all in your head. When you know what you are saying, you can make sections, or at least have a sense of the order of the book. Make provisional subheads and start arranging your points, in which I include also facts, anecdotes, etc., where you think they should go in one section or another. Often the same point will need to be repeated, or you are not sure where it would go. It will take a lot of chopping and changing to get it right. If you watch crime thrillers, then I think this is a visual that you might understand. This is how a detective organizes the material, and it's like a puzzle. You have all this material and you have to find a way of putting it together. Now we've come to structure. Let's talk about structure. how do we construct a book? Okay, constructing a book is like you have a kind of brick, and then you put other bricks on top of it to make that kind of wall. Now, all books are not constructed logically, you know, where you have one argument and then sub-arguments, and then you have a neat conclusion. Some books are organized like that, but that's not necessarily all books. So just let's look at a few examples of the way books can be structured. So one way of defining structure is by its handling of time. Another way of determining form and structure is by the layering of a well-known reported event with a greater truth about it. Yet another is to take a larger story, to take a very large story and then tell it through a person or an activity. Okay, so we're going to look at some examples of the way authors have structured their books, and I'm going to start with one of my own books. This is a biography of Vikram Sarabhai, who is best known as the founder of India's space program. And since he's best known for his achievements in the space program, even though he also kind of was responsible for starting many other institutions, one way I had possibly, you know, and it was a possible way of starting the book was to start with the first experimental rocket launch, and then to go back and forth into time. So as I said, you know, time, the handling of time, start with one thing in, let's say, 1963, and then go back to 1940, 1950, so on. That could be one way of doing it. A structure, as I said, handling of time. Well, I chose to follow a chronological structure, beginning, you know, going through the decades of his life, simply because I thought that was the best way. Since this was the first kind of biography, I had to introduce the person and all his achievements. And so I had to choose, I had to make the choice of what structure would be most appropriate, and this is the structure I chose. But again, time, the handling of time is an important factor here, and so which is why I thought this was a good example for it. Let me take another example, which is this book called News of a Kidnapping by one of the world's great novelists, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This book was originally published in Spanish in 1996, but it's a non-fiction book, unusually for a novelist. And it opens with the well-known story of kidnappings ordered by the drug lord Pablo Escobar in Colombia in the early 1990s, and then goes into the actual experiences of the victims in captivity. You know, it provides a sort of blow-by-blow account of their days through their diaries and other accounts. It kind of makes it a very kind of tense, real human account. You know, unlike, and this is why I'm talking about, it's a well-known incident. I mean, these kidnappings were well-known, reported in the news, but as I said, you kind of layer a well-known incident with a larger truth, with a deeper truth. And what he does is he uses diaries and victims' accounts to kind of make you feel the experience of being kidnapped, which is not what you get from a news event. And so that's another way of sort of thinking about form, structure, style. Yet another way that we talked about was to take a large story and tell it through a person or an activity. And in this book, Michael Lewis, who is a wonderful nonfiction writer, what he does in this book called The New Thing, a Silicon Valley story, published in 1999, it sort of opens, the book opens in a very sort of dramatic style on a computerized yacht called the Hyperion, which is owned by the internet entrepreneur Jim Clark. And this sort of, it's a crazy boat ride that the book opens with, and it's a sort of introduction to the eccentric mind and personality of Clark, whose desire it is to build this boat, which, as Lewis tells us, launched his career and changed the face of the American economy. So you're kind of getting to know Silicon Valley's rise and this sort of large story of the economy through the figure of Clark. Another recent book does something kind of similar. Um, in this book, The Day I Became a Runner, the writer Sohini Chattopadhyay, she presents stories of women athletes of different generations and spanning a very wide range of social and geographical backgrounds. In a way, telling you, kind of giving you an alternative account of modern India through the lens of women's athletics. So, again, a large story told through profiles. Um, so, as I said, there are many, many, many ways to write your book. How you will write your book will come from what you have read, what you the kind of many options that are in your mind that come from your reading, what you have already imbibed in terms of learning about form and style and structure. But they will also come from your material, because unless your material can carry the form and structure you have in mind, then you can't. You have to discard that and choose something else. It's, you know, it's a bit, talking about form and structure, you think is a bit like an architect building something. You know, as I said, you build brick upon brick, but except that the bricks would tend to be symmetrical. And here in this case, you know, you have really odds and ends and very different kinds of material from which you're sort of weaving, you know, putting together uh, the facade, or to use another analogy, you know, weaving this sort of this fabric with sort of textures and colors and so on. So, but shape and direction are very much part of a book. And you know, there are people, I mean, who think that we can just write a book, but there is a certain craft, elements of craft that go into that. And form, structure, style, as I said, are things that you have to kind of think about and bring to your work. So I'm going to kind of um, give you this sort of book as a reference. It could be something that you could look up, might help with your with how you think about style. And we're going to talk more about style, as I said. Here we're talking about form and structure. We're going to talk about writing style, tone, voice, all those things later. But with this, we will conclude lecture 7 on form and structure of our course, Appreciating and Writing Popular Nonfiction Books. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. We usually know William Shakespeare as the most revered figure in the history of English literature. But we often tend to forget that he has also been one of the most hated figures in literature. And here I'm not talking only about those boys and girls who have to memorize long sections from Macbeth or King Lear or Julius Caesar before they can go and sit for their school or college exams. But I'm also talking about people who are themselves quite famous authors. Tolstoy, for instance, considered the writings of Shakespeare to be, and I quote, crude, immoral, vulgar, and senseless. George Bernard Shaw absolutely loathed Shakespeare, as he did Homer. But perhaps no other criticism about Shakespeare is more damaging than the one which says that Shakespeare is a marvelous storyteller, provided someone has told him the story earlier. Now, this piece of criticism is particularly damaging because it is true. None of Shakespeare's plays contain any original story whatsoever. They are all written using pre-existing materials, pre-existing stories. Now, does that diminish the stature of Shakespeare as a dramatist? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippets.